Hello, this is Stacy from Truly Majestic. Let's arm knit up this heart blanket. If you're using wool roving, please lightly felt it up before you begin this project. If you're using regular yarn, you're good to go. You'll need 150 meters of white or 3 kilos and 1 kilo of blue or 50 meters, and you'll need to divide them up into the divisions that I've given in this picture. Now I've put the green at the top just so you can see how much you'll need. It doesn't need to be green, it should be white, but that's just for you to see how much you'll need. Let's start by casting on 23 stitches. Now to do that, we will be doing a mock long tail cast on, so we just simply tie a knot and then put our arm through that loop. You want the tail out the front of the knot and the working yarn in the back, and then you're going to twirl it around the opposite direction so the back yarn is in the front, and then you just simply grab the yarn, pull it through the loop and slide your hand through the next loop, and continue doing that until you've done this 23 times. You can count how many loops you've done so far by counting down these little bumps on the side. So you should know, it's always safer to knit one extra stitch than to have one less. So there's no problem if you put on 24 stitches or even 25, but you need to make sure you have at least 23. I now have 23 stitches on. There's a front and back side of this chain. The front side will have V's and the back side will have little dashes down the back. We're going to be knitting one more row into the dash side, but throughout the rest of the blanket, the side with V's should be facing you. So I'm going to pull one more stitch out, this is 24, through the side of my yarn, and that's the stitch number 1 for the next row. As you can see, one side has nice little V's, this is the front side, and the back side has dashes, and we'll be knitting into these dashes next. The easiest way to do this is to lay your work on the ground and start from there. So we're going to do that, and this is the first stitch we pulled through. It's okay if you have 25 or 26 stitches, we'll get to that on the other end. So this is the first stitch. Now I'm going to find the next dash, pull my yarn through it, and that's the second stitch, and then continue on pulling my yarn through each dash in the middle of the chain, and these will become our stitches. Try to keep them nice and even. It's not a big deal if you don't. They should be loose enough to fit on your arm. They shouldn't be extremely tight. And we have to continue this all the way till the other end of the chain. We only want to be knitting 11 stitches with one ball of yarn, and then we're going to introduce the second ball of yarn to knit the second half of this row, and that's going to bring in the intarsia technique, which will make our heart lovely. It won't be really super thick and bulky because we're not carrying the yarn across the back. So this is where the intarsia technique comes in. Okay, now that that's done, we're going to go get our second ball of yarn, and we're going to tie a knot to the back loop of the stitches here, and then we're just going to continue pulling it through the rest of the loops until we get to the end. So we have one ball of yarn doing half and another ball of yarn doing the second half. You only want 23 loops, so if you have done extra chain stitches, just make sure you don't put these extra loops inside of those. You just want 23. The entire blanket is made from a knit stitch, so that never changes. And for every single row in the entire blanket, without exception, we always slip the first stitch, that means we don't knit it, we just slip it, and KTBL the last stitch, which means we pull it straight through. And I'll show you how to do those. So anytime when I say just knit all rows, you still need to slip the first stitch and KTBL the last stitch. So here we go. This is all of our this is our yarn. We want to work with the other side of it though. We want the nice braided side to be facing us. So we're going to flip this around and get it all sorted out. Now that we have the braid side facing us, we're going to go to one side where the working yarn is all the way on the edge, and we're going to knit this first stitch. This is the only stitch in the entire blanket where we actually knit the first stitch of a row. The rest of the stitches, we always slip them. That means we just skip knitting them and just leave them on the end and go to the second stitch. To do a knit stitch, you pull the yarn from the back of the loop to the front and make a new loop. So we are going to be knitting the entire blanket, and we always go from the back of the loop to the front. Make sure your loops are nice and open because sometimes they get twisted, and it is noticeable in your blanket if you have twisted stitches. So make sure they're nice and open. Pull your yarn from the back to the front. We're going to continue working across the row until we get to the place where we have that yarn joining in the center of our row. So just continue doing your knit stitches until you get to that yarn. There are many ways to arm knit. You can hold the stitches on your arm, or you can put them on the floor loose like this. So I'm going to be doing a bit of both through this tutorial to show you both ways. Some people are more comfortable with one than the other. It's entirely up to you. Both yield beautiful results. Alrighty, it's intarsia time. So we need to make sure our yarns aren't too messed up, nice and straight, and we are going to simply twirl them around each other, and that is the intarsia technique. The purpose of twirling the yarn together like this is so it holds together. If you don't have a twirl and you just start knitting with the new yarn, you'll have two separate blankets attached by one single cast on row. So this makes the entire blanket stick together. It's very important. So we twirled it around each other, and now we're going to be knitting with the next ball of yarn that we haven't knitted the first half with. So make sure whenever you get to that intarsia part, whenever you come to the new yarn, you twirl it around each other and continue knitting with the different yarn. Don't get confused when they're both white. Make sure you're evenly taking off of both balls of yarn. Now we're coming up to the very end of the row, and the last stitch we're going to KTBL, which means knit through the back loop. It simply means pull the yarn straight through the stitch. Don't knit through the front or the back, and the yarn loops sit sideways on the ends of the blanket. They don't sit flat like the rest of the blanket, so we just pull it straight through. And that is the last stitch in this row. It's a KTBL, and now the first stitch is going to be this same stitch, and we slip it. So that means we just don't knit it. So every time you get to the end of a blanket, you KTBL and then you leave that stitch and skip to the next stitch to start your new row. So I'm going to put these on my arms now to show you arm knitting. When you put stitches on your arm should go from the back of the loop to the front, so they aren't twisted the wrong way. I'm just going to put a few loops on my arm and then knit them. So we just pull the yarn from the back of the loop to the front and then just pop it onto our other arm, or you can even pop it back onto the floor, whichever you prefer. So this is how we use our arms to arm knit. I'm just going to add a few more loops, making sure I open the loops up and go from the back of the loop to the front of the loop. And you can go the other way around, but that just means you'll have to stop, open the stitch up so it's nice and flat, and then make sure you're knitting from the back to the front. So it's always easier to take your arms in through the back of each loop to make sure they're on right. So I'm just going to get to the middle part where we're going to do the intarsia technique again. I know this is painfully slow for some of you that already know your arm knitting techniques. I'll leave a description of where to find each item and each bit in the description below, so you can skip through the video and just find what you need. If you're a beginner, just go nice and slow and easy, take your time, get your stitches right, and it's especially important that you do the intarsia technique correct and make sure you're using your yarn evenly and they're just nicely, snugly wrapped around each other. Not 10 times, just one wrap. We're coming up to the end again where we're going to be doing the KTBL. So you just hold the yarn in your hand and pull it straight off the stitch, and then slip the first stitch of the next row, which I've just done by leaving it on the arm that it was on. And now we're just going to knit the other way until we get to the center where we do the intarsia technique again. Sometimes as you're knitting along, you will be pulling the stitches too tight on the other side of your arm. So as you can see on the left side of my arm, the other stitches are kind of coming out and they drop off. So this stitch has dropped off. This isn't a big deal. You simply pull that loose yarn that's like a bar through the bottom stitch and up, and it should make your loop again. It's really important to check for drop stitches if you are knitting this way, partly on your arms, partly on the ground, because sometimes it does pull them a bit too tight. Now it's time for you to knit rows 4, 5, and 6 on your own. You're going to be doing exactly the same thing that I taught you for rows 1 to 3. So when you get finished, your row should look like this, and we're going to introduce blue now. So you need to find the very center stitch, which will be the 12th stitch down from either row. That's the center. We're going to be tying blue onto the bar behind the 12th white stitch. So we fold the first stitch down, the 12th stitch down, fold the stitch down, and then there's this bar at the back. So fold it down. This bar is what we're going to be tying our blue onto. So we just tie a regular knot. Make it nice and snug. Make sure it's in the back. We don't want it showing on the front. And then pull your loop through. And that is how we're introducing a new color of yarn. By the way, I have knitted the first half of my 7th row, so my white yarn has come all the way up to where this blue yarn needs to be. So once I've tied the blue yarn on the back, I need to actually twirl around with the intarsia technique before I take the blue loop through. And then I also need to twirl the blue yarn around the next white bit of yarn to continue on my 7th row. So this part of the blanket has lots of intarsia twirling going on, and it is a little bit bulky in the back, but as we start to move the heart shape outwards, it spreads out and it's not so intense. Once you've done the intarsia twirl again for the next side, you can continue on knitting till the end of the row. Now I'm going to knit all the way to the end of row 7 and then all the way back with the white until I'm just one stitch before the blue, and we're going to increase this blue stitch 1 stitch on each side for every row. So this is going to be another increase row for the blue. We're going to knit this stitch blue, so we want to do our intarsia technique every time we want to change a color. So before you knit that stitch, that new color, you have to twirl your yarn. So we've twirled it here. Now I'm going to put the blue through this stitch, the next stitch, and I'm going to put it through one more stitch, and then do the intarsia twirl, and then continue knitting on with my white. To save yourself from a giant twirly-whirly mess, you can also take each ball of yarn and actually pick it up and twirl it around. It takes more effort, but you have less messy yarn if you want to do it that way. So you can see now how the heart is just starting to take shape. You have a nice little point here, and then it gradually starts up the 2 sides. So we're going to knit the rest of the row down with white and then come back again, and we want to increase our blue 1 stitch each side for every row. So we finished all of row 8 and we knitted all the way to the middle again on row 9. This is row 9 and I've come to the center. Now I need to increase the blue again. So I need to do the intarsia twirl before I knit the blue into it, like this, and continue knitting the blue through all the blue stitches and add 1 more blue stitch on the other side of the heart. So remember, each time we knit a row, we are increasing the blue stitch 1 stitch on each side of for the blue heart to angle it upwards. For the full version of this video, please click the link in the description.